to welcome you to our forum on addressing sexual harassment in Illinois government. And thank you all today for attending, and thank our speakers for taking the time from their very busy schedule to have this conversation with us. Over the past few months and continuing just this week, Illinois state politics has been rocked by a discussion on issues of sexual harassment in the Illinois State House. At our reception just before this event, we heard Carrie Lester and Attorney General Madigan talk about their own experiences with this topic and really say some powerful words about what needs to be done to make change. So in order to provide a path forward, the Illinois House and Senate have established task forces to deal with this issue. And we're really honored to have the chairs and co-chairs of those task forces with us today, and I want to thank them for joining us. So one way that ICPR advocates our mission of transparent and accountable government is through in-depth research and reporting on issues in state politics. So in order to provide some context on the issue of sexual harassment in state politics, we've developed a set of best practices recommendations for reporting and investigating sexual harassment complaints in Illinois. And our moderator for this discussion, the Honorable Susan Garrett, our board chair, is going to lead the discussion with these best practices in mind, really helping use those as a guide to help Illinois understand how we can make meaningful change on this topic. At the end of the panel discussion, we'll be available for a Q&A session, so we'll pass the mic around. I do ask you to keep those questions short and make them questions, please. We'll also be taking some questions from our live stream and social media. We'd like to thank the Standard Club today for providing this space and really making all the details perfect so we can have this event. We'll be live streaming the event today on our Facebook page, so if anyone's not here, you can direct them there so that they can watch a live stream of that. And you can also join us by tweeting at ILCampaign with the hashtag TimesUpIL. Last thing, you'll find event evaluations in your programs, and I hope that you can fill that out and return it at the registration table on your way out. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Susan Garrett, our board chair, to moderate today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment of silence in recognition and memory of Chicago Police Commander Paul Bauer and the 17 victims who were brutally shot in Parkland, Florida yesterday. If we could take a moment of silence. Thank you. All right. Our goal today is to better understand how we can protect women against sexual harassment in the workplace and ensure that the process we have in place makes sense and is fair and equitable. We are going to start the program by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and give a short description of what their role is on the task force in both the House and the Senate, and then we will start asking some very interesting questions. So please get started, Senator Bush.
These live. Hi, I'm State Senator Melinda Bush. I represent the 31st District.
Yes, speak loudly, as we all do.
I was just going to say, not a problem there. Anyway, State Senator Melinda Bush. I represent the 31st District in Illinois, which is the furthest northeast district in the state, Lake County. I am one of the co-chairs of the task force in the Senate.
Thank you, everyone. My name is State Senator Christina Castro, and I'd like to thank the Campaign for Political Reform for the invitation and to be a part of this important panel. I'm new to this, but I have no plans on bending to the old system. I'm going to do what I can in my own little way to make that old system bend to me and be a better system. Let's just put it this way, I'm blunt. There's an agency director who, when I was asking some questions, decided to say, do you have a question, Senator? And let's just say, didn't go well for him. So when I was appointed to the Legislative Ethics Commission, I had told Senate President Cullerton that I plan to be a voice and to identify things that we need to change. It's a system that many people don't even know what the process is. And this is a bipartisan issue. This is an issue that affects everyone, and I look forward to working on it and fixing it.
And I'm Barbara Flynn Curry. I'm a veteran Southside lawmaker, and I am the majority leader of the Illinois House. As well, I chair our task force on sexual discrimination and harassment.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gail Golden. I'm a state senator in Rhode Island, and I'm here to say that surprisingly, sexual harassment happens in every state, not just in Illinois. And to really talk about our experience there and my belief that we should not be talking about just how do we address it in the moment or how do we penalize it and punish it and that sort of thing, but how this is really it is linked to all of the issues that devalue women. So when we don't pass equal pay and pregnancy discrimination and paid family leave and reproductive rights bills, we are just reinforcing a society that allows for sexual harassment to happen.
My name is Tom Homer, and I am actually the original Inspector General. I served 2 terms. I was the first Inspector General. I did such a wonderful job that I wasn't replaced for a couple of years. But I'm a former appellate court judge and a member of the Illinois General Assembly, served for 12 years, and a former state's attorney from the Peoria area. Pleased to be with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm State Representative Sarah Wojcicki Jimenez. I represent the 99th District, which is, I might have had the farthest drive from Illinois. I'm from Sangamon County, so I represent Springfield and many cities around Springfield and Sangamon County. I serve as the co-chair of the House's task force, and Representative Curry and I have been working together on having several meetings already since late last year.
Thank you. So let's begin with Tom Homer. He did serve as the first and only original Inspector General, Legislative Inspector General. Can you explain to us the process of filing a complaint? So I've been reading about this and researching it, and it's not really as complicated as it seems, but it is complicated, and I think before we get started, we got to know how that system works. We also have up on our screen a chart showing you all the steps that are needed to be taken.
Okay, well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you. As I mentioned, my official tenure ended back in 2014, so I haven't, been there for the last 3 or 4 years, but I can just give you kind of a general synopsis of how the process works, which I hope will be helpful. First, just very briefly, by way of background, there are actually 2 ethics acts in the state of Illinois. One was passed back in 1967, and then the second act was passed in 2003. The 2003 Act did not repeal the prior act. The prior act actually set up a code of conduct and rules of ethics for members of the General Assembly. Although in so passing it, the legislature added some verbiage that said that most of those provisions are intended only as guides to legislator conduct and not meant to be enforced by disciplinary actions. So it was certainly a very weak statute, but it was the first attempt to have one. Then in 2003, the second act was passed, which primarily established the Inspector General and ethics commissions and ethics officers, and it delineated certain specific acts which are prohibited. For example, prohibited political activity, so that legislators can't have their staffs work on political matters while being paid by the state. There were some regulations about campaign contributions. You can't take them on state property. You can't hold a fundraiser in Springfield when the legislature's in session. There are gift bans. Legislators can't accept, and state employees can't accept gifts of more than $100 from a lobbyist in the course of any calendar year. There were some revolving door prohibitions, so people couldn't use their position and leverage a position in the private sector. So there were certain things set out in that act, the 2003 Act, which is how I'll refer to them because the nomenclature is sort of similar. So you've got this 1967 Act with no teeth, and you've got the 2003 Act with limited types of action. So The problem became that during the time, at least I was the Inspector General, that about 80% of the complaints that came to me were not violations of the Ethics Act, not the new one. Most of them involved conflicts of interest or abuse of power, things that ostensibly fit under the old unenforceable act. There was a provision in that old act, and still there, that it's a catch-all. It says, no legislator may engage in any other conduct which constitutes a breach of public trust. Sort of a umbrella catch-all. And so as these matters would come to me, and I would say, well, gee, this doesn't really fit within the current Ethics Act. Is there anything at all that I can do? And so I would often turn to that particular catch-all provision, as ungratifying as it was. But the problem was that the new act, also that set up the commission, only gave the commission jurisdiction over violations of the new act. So 80% of the things that came to me, I could investigate because I was given broad powers to look into any wrongdoing. But then when you looked at what the jurisdiction of the commission was, it was limited to the specific offenses of the new act. And so oftentimes there'd be a dilemma because something would come in, looked wrong. I would investigate it, find, yes, this is bad. This shouldn't have happened. Somebody did something wrong. And of course, then the question was, well, what are you going to do about it? And the unsatisfactory answer often was not a whole heck of a lot, other than I certainly was able to and did issue what we call summary reports, which is a founded report, and filed it with the commission. And I could ask that report be published, but it was up to the commission whether it ever got published.
And is that the Legislative Commission,
Yes,
Ethics Commission?
Legislative Ethics Commission. And so in 2009, the act was actually strengthened, and it did a couple of important things that were really good. One is before that, the 2003 Act said that I could not self-initiate anything, nor could I accept an anonymous complaint. So if somebody complained to me, and that often happened in anonymity, didn't sign their name, that somebody did something wrong but didn't sign their name, I was precluded from even looking into it. Or if I read the paper in the morning and saw something looked horrible, under the 2003 Act, I couldn't self-initiate. I had to wait until somebody filed a complaint. Well, in 2009, both of those were remedied. And so from that point on, I could self-initiate. I also could take anonymous complaints. So those were some major benefits. Another provision in 2009 dealt with when you publish these reports. And remember, initially, only the commission can publish. I can recommend, but it takes 5 votes out of 8 members of a bipartisan commission. There are 2 members from each of the 4 legislative caucuses, so there's 4 House members, there's 4 senators, and there are 4 Republicans, and there are 4 Democrats. And so the change in 2009 said any time that one of these investigations leads to a suspension of 3 days or more, it must be published. It's mandatory. Any other times, it's still up to the discretion of the commission. Well, the problem is that no one has authority to suspend a legislator, right? The people do at the ballot box. But I certainly didn't, and the commission didn't, and the leaders didn't. And so as a result, there was never a case against a legislator which automatically required publication. And as a result, any matters against a legislator that the Inspector General found were founded, even though the Inspector General can recommend that it be published, it's up to the commission whether or not it be published.
So are you saying that what we have here is a 2-tiered weak system? Or would you say that all the components are in place, and when somebody files a complaint, there's a process in which to go through that can easily be remedied?
Right. So there are current limitations, and just turning to your flow chart. So let me just deal with that. So a complaint. Well, let's just say as a complaint of sexual harassment before the new act. You know, now it's been that conduct is now specifically included in the new act that I was talking about. So it's been moved from that, you know, from not being in the act to being in the act. So henceforth, if a complaint comes to the Inspector General that there's been a matter of sexual harassment, then the Inspector General will first make a preliminary look at it to make sure that it's an employee that's covered by the Ethics Commission. You know, there's an Executive Ethics Commission that covers all other state employees, including university employees. So sometimes people would file complaints with me that I had no jurisdiction of, and I would send to the executive. But let's suppose it involves, by the way, who are under the jurisdiction of the Legislative Inspector General? Well, all of the 177 legislators, but also their staffs, and also all the legislative support agencies. There's different agencies such as the Legislative Reference Bureau and Information Service and Economic and Fisc and JCAR and others. All of those fall under the jurisdiction of the Legislative Ethics Commission. So the matter comes in. First determination is that, you know, this could be serious. This could be, you know, this is someone I have jurisdiction over. It's an alleged violation of the act now. And so, but before I can move forward, you'd think that would be enough, right, to look into it? But after the act was passed in 2003, the commission immediately adopted rules. And one of the rules it imposed, before I ever started, was that before I could launch an investigation, I had to have the approval of the commission. And so what did that mean? Well, that meant I had to go before the 8 members and get a majority approval to launch a commission, to launch an investigation. It wasn't very often that I was denied that. These are by and large very good people. But there were times where I wasn't, and furthermore, and most made it more difficult, is that the commission only met once a month, and then sometimes not even that. The statute said they're to meet once a month, but oftentimes it would be, you know, postponed. And so if I'm sitting there with a new complaint, and I call the executive director of the commission, and I say, Randy, when's the commission meet next? Not until, they were supposed to meet next week, but they've canceled it, so we're going to meet in March. You know, what do I do for the next 5 weeks, you know, while the trail's hot, right? So one of my strong recommendations is, and that's not a statutory matter, that's a matter of the rules. That rule needs to be changed. There should be no need for the Inspector General to defer to the commission on getting approval to investigate what the law requires the person to investigate. So in any event, but I'm telling you the current rules, so you go before the commission, get approval, and then you launch into an investigation, and you know, I think the law has changed. It used to be you had to do it within 12 months of the last allegation. I think that the legislature amended that, at least for that backlog, right, Barb? I think that's right. So I don't know if it's still 12 months, but when I was there, I had 12 months, and then...
It is 12 months. I've just been given the sign.
Pardon me?
It is 12.
Oh,
12 months.
Okay, still 12. So then I would, if I found that there was wrongdoing, I would, and I also could subpoena. But before I could subpoena, I had to get permission from the commission for a subpoena. Now, that's a matter of statute. That was in the original statute, in addition to being in the rule. But, so I conduct my investigation. Then I would, if I found wrongdoing, I would submit a report. We call it a summary report, founded report, to that persons that I'm investigating ultimate jurisdictional authority, which meant For a House Democrat, it would be the House Speaker and so forth. Or if it was one of the agencies, it would be their agency director. They would then have 20 days from the time I submitted that to respond to me. And in my recommendations, my report, I would make recommendations as to what to be done with that person. If they could either agree or do something more, or they could choose not to do what I recommended. After that report is back, I file with the commission, and then I have a choice to make. If I feel satisfied that everything was worked out, you know, we got a satisfactory disposition, that might be the end of it, except to tell the commission. If I think it's more egregious, I can ask the Attorney General to file a formal complaint before the commission. And if the Attorney General agrees, they don't have to, but if they agree, they then take over the case. They file the complaint, and once they file the complaint, then the commission itself has 30 days to determine whether to hear that complaint. I mean, even though I and the Attorney General may have decided it was sufficient, the commission ultimately decides whether it should be heard or not. Assuming it should be heard, then a hearing process is set up, and there's a hearing with a court reporter, although it's closed, it's not open to the public. And if at the end of that, the commission agrees that there was an offense, a violation of the act, then at that point, the commission would announce and make public the proceedings, not just the decision, but open up the transcript and the records. So that in a nutshell, I probably used my time, but I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of, you know, where things stand, and hopefully by bringing out some of what I saw as deficiencies, you know, it will help lead to some remedies that will, you know, make these matters more relevant and more enforceable. Somebody once told me when I first started in the legislature, Tom, you need to do more press releases and announcements. You know, you just passed a bill, and he said to me, he said, you know, Tom, in this town, if it ain't in the paper or the TV, it didn't happen. And you know, that always stuck with me, because I think there's a parallel with this area. That even though we may be working feverishly and doing our due diligence, if there's no transparency, the assumption and the skepticism is going to be that nothing's being done. And so I think, you know, you have to have independence and you have to have transparency. And those things are both lacking currently, in my opinion.
So your office, the office of the Legislative Inspector General, was vacant. And it was vacant for years. And without somebody in that position, anybody can answer this, where do you go if you want to file a complaint? And the second part to that question is, why was it vacant so long? Who has the power to appoint?
The appointment comes from a majority of the members of the commission. And my understanding is that the reason that the vacancy lasted so long was because there were no applicants. Now, why that is, I don't know. I do know that when the most recent occupant of the office resigned, that there were press releases, there were announcements in the newspapers, but others didn't come forward. This is not a full-time job, and it may be that people who are lawyers and interested in this wanted a full-time job. It also doesn't pay as well as many other jobs in the legal profession. So whether we ought to bring it in-house, whether we ought to be setting salaries in a different kind of way, Tom, you may have some insights into why it is no one wanted to follow you and Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was honored to have the job. It was a part-time job, and so I suppose that I had my own law practice after I retired as a judge, and so I didn't lobby and never lobbied, never had state contracts. So for me, it wasn't a problem, but I know the gentleman who succeeded me, he was, I think, the chairman of one of the large Chicago law firms, and very honorable gentleman, been a former U.S. attorney, a lot of credentials, well respected. And I know he stepped down after a short period, and I think a part of that may have been because he recognized that it was going to be very difficult to separate his legal responsibilities from those as being an inspector general. And so, because it's a part-time job, you have to have somebody who who really is not connected, I think, in any professional way with the state or the legislature.
Senator Castro, did you want to add to that?
I do want to add one caveat. The commission does approve the person, but it's the 4 leaders who select the person.
Right.
So the 4 leaders select the person, and I do understand there are members of the commission who had submitted names. And being new to the commission, I'm trying to understand how this process works. And the process failed. It did, it failed. And it failed 27 complaints that were there. They sat there for 2 years. The new inspector general has been appointed and has been due diligently working to address those issues and has. But the process failed. And I think that some of the things that we have, and this is what I think the Sexual Harassment Task Force is, looking at the Legislative Ethics Commission and other things, what can we do better and what can we do different to address that? So there is more transparency, as Tom Homer said, to make it a more thorough process. But everyone's to blame in this, and now it's how do we move forward? And that's what my goal is.
But
So-
I just want to make
Go
the
ahead,
point that
Barbara.
nobody applied for the job. There were some informal conversations with people who might have been interested, but there was no applicant who was rejected either by the 4 leaders or by the members of the commission. So I agree with the senator. We need to do a better job, but I'm not quite sure which way that points us. It isn't that there were wonderful applicants out there who got rejected for crass political reasons. There were no applicants out there. So we need to find either a different way to structure the Office of the Inspector General for the Legislative Ethics Commission, or we need to find out from practicing lawyers what it is it would take for them to decide to give us a hand.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add, I can't imagine a more important job, whether somebody didn't apply. Was there a sort of application process? Was it posted somewhere that this particular position was vacant? Was there really somebody who was committed to finding the Inspector General, Legislative
And I think
Inspector
that's
General?
obviously a way for us to go,
Yeah.
to find a better way to publicize that this is now available.
It's been
There were lots
publicized.
of newspaper reports about the prestigious Bill Roberts who was leaving the post, but that's not the same as making it clear through other avenues that there is an opening.
So this is open to everybody. Go ahead,
I'd like
Senator
to just
Bush.
add to that. There's a saying, my mom used to say to me, when we know better, we do better. I think people weren't watching. I think that the job really wasn't being done to the level it should have been done. And sadly, it's taken women coming forward and the media to force these bodies to take a serious look at themselves. We see it from what's gone on in California with actors and directors, and sadly, I just think we weren't watching.
So
I
we're
think-
watching now.
Absolutely.
And we do have a Legislative Inspector General in place. Now, is she permanent? Is she temporary?
She's
Where is
apparently
she?
willing to work with the backlog of the 27 cases that had been filed, and then she wants to drop the job. She's not interested in doing it as a permanent proposition, but she was willing to step up to the plate to deal with the backlog.
Can I just say really quick, in terms of the vacancy for almost 3 years, I think that whether or not there were applicants, whether or not it was publicized, that was an enormous failure of the process. And what I want to bring it back to as well is for those complainants who filed 27 complaints that sat on somebody's desk for years. That is something that is, even though I wasn't on the commission, I'm a fairly new legislator, I accept responsibility for that failure. And I think at a minimum, we have to look at the process. We have a person on this panel today that served in that role for 10 years. So I don't subscribe to the fact that, no, we can't get anybody to do the job. And we have to do better at that. I think also we have to look at that very simple thing that really helped blow this issue up in Illinois, in my opinion, to make sure we have a backstop. If the commission can't agree on bringing someone in, we have to get somebody in there. I mean, it's very obvious to me. So I just want to say that, and I think all the people on this panel are very committed to that, and we obviously need to do much better.
So let's talk a little bit about the goals moving forward. We know that there was neglect in the past. I don't think anybody disputes that. But now we have this great opportunity. Both the House and the Senate are going to meet until the end of December 2018 to determine a path forward. So out of all that convoluted the process, not having legislative inspector general, the legislative ethics commission maybe having too much power, where should the power really lie? What is your, so far, what are some of the things that you think we should adopt going forward so we can clean up this process?
Susan.
And go ahead.
Well, let me just say that.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Just one quick clarification. The Legislative Inspector General is on contract till June 2018. She is taking new cases as they come. So that's I just want to clarify that. Yeah, she is taking new cases, and she will continuously serve until even we find a replacement once her contract, if we are willing. The commission has begun that process, and we've had, I've seen members of the commission, we've had some very robust conversations on how do we make this process more transparent, how do we get qualified people in a part of it. But from how do we fix this process, I think one of the things that I'm doing is, being a new member, to address what Tom Homer talked about, I have introduced a bill that would give the Legislative Inspector General more teeth, meaning they would not have to come to the commission for permission to investigate, that they could have subpoena authority.
And so why do you think that they should have more teeth? Why do you think the Legislative Inspector General should make some key decisions without getting approval from the Legislative Ethics Commission comprised of legislators on both sides of the aisle?
Well, if you look at the other Legislative Inspector Generals from the different divisions, as Tom had mentioned, they don't have to get permission from anybody. It's a transparency issue. You keep hearing we can't police ourselves. Well, if you have to go, the Legislative Inspector General has to go and get permission from a commission. It's while everyone in the commission has done their best and will never not deny an investigation, it is that vision of what it appears.
So do you think too much, I'm going to use the word bias, could rest with the commissioners, which are Republicans and Democrats, and chosen by the party leaders, to make the kind of decisions in an independent way?
Absolutely.
Do you think that really is the crux of
Absolutely.
the problem? So you want to give the Legislative Inspector General more authority to sort of go around them and not let the political side be part of the process.
Correct.
I don't know if there's agreement from everybody on that.
I think the other thing too is, we keep hearing, well, that's a witch hunt, and no, that is not the idea of what we're doing. Is if the Inspector General has a complaint, they should be able to just investigate it, look it out, and without delay. I know Tom had mentioned that the commission didn't meet regularly when he was there. We actually talk to the Legislative Inspector General and we say, do you have anything else? Please call a special meeting, we will meet. And we've had several meetings at her request where she has stuff that she wants to investigate. So those are some of the things that we should change and will change.
So there are legislative initiatives I know that are out there. And so the legislative initiative, one that we're talking about, is to give the Legislative Inspector General more authority to make decisions. And is everybody in agreement with that, Gail? I know you can't really.
I think it's definitely worth looking at, but at this point, our task forces are focused on sex discrimination and sex harassment. So the larger question, because there are many other issues that come before the inspectors general for the executive branch as well as for the legislative branch, and it seems to me what we've been trying to do is get our hands around the issues of discrimination and harassment in the private sector as well as in the public, and that isn't easy to do. Let me tell you, we started out with tutorials from the Attorney General's office and from women employed to talk about the whole continuum of harm, from criminal sexual assault to catcalls from the construction crew down the street. We've established what are the procedures, not just for the legislative inspector general, but for the executive inspectors general, the Illinois Department of Human Rights, the Federal Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and the Illinois Commission on Human Rights. Those are procedures we have to better understand if we're going to propose ways to get out of this mess. So I think there are a lot of items on our plate, and I'm happy to talk about them, but I don't want to take up too much
Okay.
time until it's my turn again.
Senator Gooden, could you comment, like in Rhode Island, is the process similar? You don't have to go into great detail, but is your process for reporting complaints similar to that of Illinois, or is it?
No, we have a vastly different system. We, in Rhode Island, legislators and lobbyists and any political office holder falls under our Fair Employment Practices Act, which means you're an employee like any other employee. All of the claims in Rhode Island for EEOC and everything's handled by the Human Rights Commission. So if you have a claim for sexual harassment at your regular work or one within the legislature, you would file it with the Human Rights Commission. We do also have an ethics commission, which has to do with campaign finance and money and things that have to do with that oversees the legislature about money, which is totally separate from the legislature. And it has staff, employees who are doing the investigatives and a board that reports out. But in terms of the sexual harassment, it is a separate thing. And in many ways, that is removing a lot of the politics and putting back in a lot of the transparency. The flip side of that is I asked the Human Rights Commission this week if anybody had come forward ever to file a complaint in Rhode Island. They told me not since the 1980s. From the General Assembly. Obviously, they're dealing with sexual harassment claims every day from every other workplace. And so it really gets to the question of why is that? Is it that we have not done a good enough job explaining that that's the process within our legislature? Or is it the dynamics of those relationships in politics that prevents people from willing to risk their careers or their capacity to pass bills or their reputation that prevents them from ever saying anything? So for instance, we have certainly, as I'm sure you do here, women who are lobbyists who have to make a decision about whether or not they should speak up and potentially risk their livelihood or find a different career. And I think that is far more the outcome than filing a sexual harassment claim.
So there are usually around 20-25% of legislators are women, female, in any given General Assembly. And I think that's, pardon me, what?
We're a lot better than that in the House.
In the House?
Yeah, we are.
And you're at what, 30-something?
38, 37, 38%.
Okay, but generally it's a minority. That's the point I'm trying to make. And so we heard some of our speakers earlier talk about how it's somewhat of a male-dominated culture. And I'm wondering if that is part of the reason why we are like swimming upstream and trying to figure out what to do. And here it is 2018, and how can we address this and look at the culture maybe of Illinois or just maybe across the country, that women are in a minority position in a very male-dominated sector. What can we do to change that?
Well, first of all, we can elect more women.
Yes, all right.
Let's just be clear on that. And secondly, this has been, I'm going to talk from a little bit of a personal perspective. So, I'm a woman in my early 60s. And when the Me Too movement really started, I really kind of had to rethink everything because I've lived my whole life a particular way. I learned to swear like a truck driver so that I could fit in with men in meetings. I learned to adjust my behavior. I don't stay out late at night. I don't go drinking in Springfield. And I finally had to come to a place where I had to say, if I chose to go out in Springfield and get intoxicated, where I was totally stupid, it is still their responsibility for their behavior. So there's a cultural shift that is going on here, and it is a huge responsibility for those of us that sit here. We do sit in a place of privilege. We do. If someone treats me badly and I tell them, I take them on, I do whatever, I don't lose my job. I'm elected by the people. So I do sit in a place of privilege. But because of that privilege, we've got to find a way. I'm listening to this, and it's so hard because the task force, as a leader said, our task is to look at sexual harassment laws as they span private, public. That's our task. And at the same time, believe me, we are filing bills left and right because we know there are things that need to be changed right away.
Right. So it's the culture. So lobbyists and legislators staying out late at night, all happens. But when somebody is harassed sexually, is it acceptable in Illinois to file a complaint and be part of a process when you know there might be backlash? And that backlash, you know, as Carrie Lester said, you know, it can cost you a relationship, as Lisa Madigan said. And it's all about relationships. We come to Springfield, we hear it's all about relationships. But if somebody is working against you in creating havoc, then what is the best course of action? And how transparent is it and should it be?
Well, let me just say that retaliation in an employment situation really is illegal. You're not allowed. If somebody comes forward with a complaint about time spent on politics rather than on the job or discrimination, and then they are retaliated against, that is a no-no. Now, we know that's the law, but does it have any impact on real people in real circumstances? I think that the Me Too movement, the celebrity voices that we have heard, has made a difference already in terms of the culture. It is my hope that we can make sure that whatever mechanisms we find to make the world a fairer, better place also will reverberate, not just among the celebrity culture types, but the hotel maid, the woman who's the sole support of her family, who's working at the greasy dive down the street. Can we make her feel comfortable and empowered that she has recourse as well? We do need to change the culture. I'm sure we need to change some laws, but it really is a cultural paradigm that we need to work on. And you're right, let's elect more women, let's have more women in boardrooms, more women in positions of power across the private sector as well as the public. But it is that voice that we need to hear and that we need to help expand. We need to shout from the rooftops. There is a place to go. There is an opportunity, an avenue for redress. We need to let people know that, and we need to make them feel that it's okay for them to come forward and that we will protect them against any kind of retaliation that somebody has in mind.
I
So-
think
go
that
ahead.
the process that we have right now, whether it's having a vacancy for several years or seeing victims come forward by themselves a lot of times in front of television cameras explaining their story, that should signify to us that our process is broken because they feel like going to the media is their process. That's their vindication because they've tried. Like Senator Garrett said, you know, we have lots of processes in place. We have rules in place. We have laws in place. We have all these things in place. But for some reason, victims are still feeling that it's riskier to come forward and explain their circumstance than to stay quiet. And I think that is a very difficult charge for us to figure out how do we change our process and make it something that's more accessible and that victims feel is fair. Because for me, in my own experience, you know, I'm fairly new to the legislature, but I've worked in the media and on staff. And one of the things that was brought up today is even though this has blown up and there's been a Me Too movement, and I think people are paying very close attention, I can't tell you in those days following, as a legislator, as a person in a privileged position, when somebody would give me a hug and say, well, can we still do that?
Yeah.
Or they'd reach out for my hand as a handshake and say, well, now is this a violation?
Well, I'm glad they're asking that question.
Well, they are, but I think it really makes the situation, it again puts you frozen in time as a legislator. I mean, I'm in a position where I can vote for laws and I can do a lot of things in a position of power. But even for me, as a person who, as a young reporter, was pulled in for a kiss in the press box to, in another situation, there was a felony stalking charge filed against someone. This has happened my whole career. And so the weight and responsibility of how do we change this and make this better, not only for everyone in this room, but for future generations, we have a process that is broken.
And I think people are looking for the General Assembly in Illinois to lead by example. You know, one of the things I hear is that, well, they're going to change some laws, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, it's going to be a patchwork process, and nothing, you know, maybe things will change enough on the surface. But I think what people are really hoping for is that you take really strong action and that you stand up for some of these. It's just not passing a law that might have a loophole in it here and there, that you stand behind everything you say and that you take a position that other women in the state, whether they're employed through, you know, a government agency, a county, a municipality, or a private business, know that you've got their backs. And so tell me that that's going to happen. Tell everybody out here that's going to happen.
But let me just tell you some of the items that are on our plate as a task force on sex discrimination and harassment. And there are lots of them, and they're not all simple. For example, if you are a worker in the private or the public sector, you can go to the Illinois Department of Human Rights with a complaint about discrimination, about harassment, about unequal wages. You can do that, but you can only do it 6 months after the last event. Well, many are suggesting we should extend that. It should at least be a year. Maybe it should be longer. Should it apply only to issues of sex harassment, or should it apply to every complaint that might come before the Illinois Department of Human Rights? There are other places where, for example, we saw a whole lot about the federal Congress when Representative Dingell and many others were using public funds to settle harassment claims, right? They were using public funds and the public went berserk. Well, there's reason to go berserk, but let me just pose this question to you. Suppose that there was an instance of harassment and Representative Dingell or Representative so-and-so didn't have the resources to make that victim whole. Is the public purse the make whole place of last resort? Then there are those who said if you have used public funds, then there has to be full disclosure. Well, that's great, but what about the victim who had hoped for confidentiality? So a lot of the questions that we have today, a lot of the issues that we're looking at, do not have obvious, easy answers. Some of the complaints we've heard recently came from campaign workers. Well, campaign workers in politics, in political action committees, they today can't come to the government, but they can go to the Illinois Department of Human Rights. If you're a campaign staffer, that's your right. But if you're an intern, if you're a volunteer, if you are a campaign consultant, you don't have quite the same relationship with the employer as does the actual staffer. So should we look at questions like making sure that campaign consultants can also go to the Department of Human Rights and bring a complaint against a badly behaved campaigner? There are lots of thorny questions, and it's unfortunate that there are, because it's much more interesting to talk about the salacious press conferences than it is to talk about policy wonk kinds of things. But I think we have to be aware that it isn't as easy as waving a magic wand and suddenly the world is a different place.
Correct. I just want to point out that the state of California, how they deal with sexual harassment, every entity, every business body that has 50 employees or more is under this sexual harassment process. They are able to appeal and file complaints and everything. I'm not saying that Illinois should do that.
But Illinois, for sexual harassment, you have to have a lower threshold of employees in order to bring a complaint before the Illinois Department of Human Rights. So if I'm complaining about wage disparity, I think you have to have at least 15 employees before I can go to the Department of Human Rights. But if I'm a victim of sexual harassment, I get to go with either 1 or 2 employees is enough.
Okay, so what happens with counties and municipalities? We're talking about state government now, and to a certain extent you brought up campaigns, which is also an interesting topic these days. But what about outside of Springfield? Are we going to take a look at other governments? Is there a way to handle that? And I would add campaigns in that as well.
We hope to, in our task force, our plan is to hear from counties and from cities. We are going to jointly hear from the National Conference of State Legislatures to find out what are best practices. If any state has established best practices, we'd like to know more about it. And we certainly want to hear from the private sector, what programs do some employers have in place that make it clear that harassment in the workplace is not acceptable, and are able to show us procedures that will make it easier for people to bring complaints and to be made whole.
Okay,
So
I know, Melinda.
Susan, so you asked if how long it's going to take the task force, and are we really going to have to wait till December? So what I want to share with you is this. We have bills that are being filed by a number of legislators, some very good bills, some that we really need to take a look at to make sure that they're really going to achieve what we think they're going to achieve. So we're going to be holding subject matter hearings. Every one of the bills that is being filed, our task force is going to listen to those. And the task force will weigh whether we think that's the right thing to do, and we will be signing on to those bills and saying we believe they should be passed. So we are doing that, as Barbara just indicated. We are bringing in, we've been looking to get them in a little bit earlier, but looks like probably, I think, the end of March, if I remember
Yeah, I think
correctly.
March 27th, it's a
Right.
public hearing here in Chicago, and you're all welcome.
Where we will have people come in from certainly other state governments and actually the federal government to talk to us about what they're doing, so we can take a look and see, some of the things that you said in Rhode Island. I was just thinking, well, that makes sense. We seem so complex.
Well, we were excluded, the legislative body was
sure.
excluded from the Human Rights Commission
But
as
anyway,
far as filing
I wanted
complaints.
you to know
We-
that. So there will be bills that'll be coming forward much more quickly. And as soon as the task force feels that it's done, they will have its report. We're given to the end of to December, but it doesn't mean that it's going to take that long.
So
And there are
let's-
some workplaces that ban workplace romances. Do we want to do that? Do we think that it's a good idea to say to people, you may not all of us have seen romances blossom in the workplace, and then sometimes we've seen those romances go on to not only blossom but bear significant fruit. We've all seen them collapse unpleasantly as well. So is that, I think my recollection is that under the new federal House legislation, that they do ban certain kinds of relationships, personal relationships among certain staffers. So that's something that we might want to take a look at. But then the risk on the other side is you're talking nanny state territory. So those are tough issues.
So what about transparency? We've heard the word float around, and from what I understand, so correct me if I'm wrong here, reports are filed, somebody's been found guilty of wrongdoing, but those names, are they redacted or are they part of the record? Because the last thing you would want is for somebody to be a sexual harasser in state government and not have the public know who that person is, and that person might be fired from their job with the state, but then gets another job someplace else with no paper trail as to some of the harassment issues associated with him. So how do we feel about that? And maybe Tom, you're the person to.
Well, the statute does currently provide and has provided that when the commission decides to publish a report, that it has the authority to redact. It doesn't specifically delineate what names should be redacted. I always took the position, and I think the commission, that the guilty party wouldn't have his or her name redacted, that would somewhat make the publication superfluous. But there could be redactions of other people, and in particular the alleged victim. One of the provisions of the Illinois statute is that there's a right of confidentiality. So although it used to be that you couldn't file an anonymous complaint, or if you did, it wouldn't be looked at, now it's always been the case that that a person filing a complaint has the right of confidentiality. And so typically you would see their name redacted from the report. Now oftentimes that's not really a meaningful protection, because if there are news stories been reporting or it's obvious by the fact pattern who it is that is being spoken of, it may not be a full shield, but the commission does have the authority and the responsibility to redact any information or names that would unfairly malign an innocent party.
And do you agree with that? I mean, are you in support of that, or would you ask that, or would you, do you believe that there should be more transparency? For the point of, do you want these people out there in government, again, in a different location maybe, but, you know,
Well, yeah,
should there be a
I
record
would
of
have
who they are?
I would not be sympathetic to redacting a guilty party's identity,
None
but
of
I am.
us would, right.
But I am sympathetic to the idea that that innocent people, to the extent it's possible, should be protected, and in particular the complaining witness where it's possible.
And particularly in cases of sexual harassment, where we know there is a good deal of anxiety. If I go forward, will I face retaliation? Will there be stigma? Will people say, oh yeah, she brought it on herself? That's why I raised the question, what do you do about the congressional use of the public purse for settlements in this arena? Do we say, oh yes, we want full disclosure, full transparency, even though the person with whom you settled said, I don't want anybody to know about this? Now, personally, I hope that the end result of the Me Too movement, all the things that we are doing, not only in Illinois but across the country, I am hopeful it will lead to more women being willing to come forward and saying, this happened to me, it's unacceptable, and not face stigma, not face retaliation, feel empowered to make the complaint. That, to me, should be our goal. But along the way, I don't think you can say to a woman in that circumstance, never mind what you think, we're going to make your circumstance public information.
So there's an elephant in the room, and that is the recent publicity around a campaign worker, Kevin Quinn, and somebody who accused him of harassment. What I was really interested in was that both candidate Pritzker and Kennedy, running for governor, both have referred to, and I have their quotes here, they believe there should be an investigation of how this happened. So I'm just wondering, how would that happen, and what do you think they're talking about? Would that be the Department of Human Rights? Would that be the Legislative Inspector General? You know, what are they talking about investigation? I'm not opposed to an investigation. I'm just not sure where they would go.
I think they're talking politics, so it's hard for me to know what exactly they have in mind, except that I think it's called a good political hit. My own sense, I don't know, I mean...
Well, should there be an investigation, I guess? Maybe
me?
That's a better question. Should there be an investigation?
Well, what I know of the facts of this case, and I may not know them all, but my understanding of the timelines and so forth is that the issue was handled by the Speaker's office appropriately with a lawyer who has actually been involved in these kinds of issues for a long time, working for his campaign committee, who did the kind of investigation that we all want to see happen. And my sense, given what I know about the case, is that the Speaker responded appropriately and in a timely manner. I don't know where else this investigation would go. It's not something I think that a campaign consultant can take to the Illinois Department of Human Rights, and even if she could, she's past the timeline, which is why I raised the question, do we want to extend the deadline Or do we want to include campaign consultants? I think those are heavy questions.
We're hearing that there's more out there. We're hearing that other campaign workers might come forward. And so if that's the case, that's unfortunate. But if there should be, if we're putting ourselves, state government, elected officials, to a standard, should that standard also include campaigns underneath the Republican Party of Illinois or the Democratic Party of Illinois?
I guess this is, I think for me, I think it's sometimes difficult to opine on all the facts of these cases because a lot of what I've read, I've seen in the media or online. I think, though, that one of the things that I think there are a lot of questions around this case, and I think for us on the state side, I do think that this individual who's being accused was a state worker at some point, and I know that that has been terminated, but I'm not sure, and I can certainly ask, what the time frame on that was, but I think if there is an avenue for further review, I'm sure the Inspector General, Legislative Inspector General, is aware. We have Ethics Commission members here today. I think that those are some of the questions I have in terms of he was fired from his state work, but also campaign work. It seems like most of the activity was on the campaign side, but he was also a state worker at some point. Yeah. So I think there are still some questions that can be asked around this case, and I think that we should. We should continue to, we will learn to how to go forward for better process by learning what has happened in the past, and I think we need to get some of those answers.
Yeah, it's a gray area. I'm just wondering if moving forward as you deal with legislative initiatives, if these are the kinds of things you should include, and maybe Tom, you have an opinion on that. Is this something that we should include?
I don't have any. I don't have any direct knowledge of the incident that's being discussed, other than having read in the newspaper. The jurisdiction, as I mentioned earlier, of the Legislative Inspector General is over employees of the legislative branch of government.
Not campaigns.
And I don't know, I didn't know that this alleged offender was a state employer. Even if a state employee, for the Inspector General of the legislature, would have to be in a legislative position. If it was a position outside the legislature, then it would fall under the executive Inspector General. But the Legislative Inspector General would have no jurisdiction over
currently.
Campaign.
But do you think that law should be changed to include campaigns of both major parties? So I'm not pointing the finger at one or the other, but when we,
If you change it, you might want to make, as I say, if you talk about campaign workers, I'm a staff member of Citizens for Durkin, whatever it is, and I'm a staffer, and I feel it as if I've been discriminated against, harassed, paid unequal wages, whatever it is, I can go to the Illinois Department of Human Rights, just so I do so within 6 months from the time of the last tragedy. So a question is, should we expand that to a longer time period? Yeah. If we do that, do we want to make all complaints that come before the Department of Human Rights have a longer statute of limitations? And do we want to say it to the Department of Human Rights when it comes to certain kinds of operations in the private sector, political campaigns, trucking firms, I don't know what, that independent contractors, volunteers, and interns should be covered as well? They are not covered today.
right. So do you think, and I'm pretty sure that campaign workers do not have sexual harassment training. I turned into a lobbyist, even though I'm really not a lobbyist, but I have to advocate on behalf of ICPR. I took that sexual harassment training. Should campaign workers do it? Is that something we could, that's a simple added.
That's certainly something that we should look at. We did say about lobbyists that you have to go to sexual harassment training, and we could think about expanding that to other sectors. Or any sensible campaign today, I would say, would be jumping up and down, telling the press exactly what procedures they are now putting into place to make sure that their campaign workers understand that harassment in the campaign activity is a no-no.
Great. I'm going to open up for questions. Jamila, do you want to just There's a woman right here in the 1, 2, 3rd row, right on the aisle. Do you want to raise your hand? And really make it a question, no statements.
Okay, that's
Okay.
fair enough. I am all for broad spectrum feminist investigation. But legislators are a special case, right? Any abuse of power affects the laws that we all live under. So here's my question. Why is it that members of the legislature who are found to have sexually harassed somebody and therefore abused their power, why is it that they are not expelled the same way that the U.S. Senate expelled Joe McCarthy?
Expelled who? Expelled who? Who did you say expelled who?
Oh, the way the U.S. Senate expelled Joe McCarthy back before you were born.
Yeah, right, no. Well, we do have procedures in place for ethical violations among members for a certain amount of discipline. And I'm not sure whether we could actually expel somebody without impeachment or some other procedure. But yes, I think there ought to be an opportunity for legislators to hold one another liable and responsible for bad behavior.
Actually, if I may, the House did expel a member a few years ago.
Right,
There-
Mr. In fact, I was the chair of the committee that sent him on his merry way. For sex harassment? No, this was bribery. Yeah, and so I think it would have the same authority.
If I may, I think that a couple of tools that should be given to the commission that they don't now have over legislators is to issue a reprimand or censure. Because those are really, to a person in political office, those are very, very meaningful sanctions, more than a fine, because your reputation is the most important part of it. And if your peers judge that you should be censured or lesser extent reprimanded, I think that would be a very significant weapon. Well, expulsion, I think, is beyond the ability of the, I don't think the commission, currently both the House and Senate are able to expel members under their own rules. And that's an extreme measure. I don't know that it would be good public policy to delegate that to a small committee.
We're going to move on. It was a great question. Thank you. And I like the idea of censure. I can't see. Go ahead. Right in the middle.
It's going to be hard not to make a comment, but I'm old, so this subject is not new. I think what is new about it, and I applaud it, is the Me Too movement. But for women of color, and I can particularly speak for African American women, I am a lawyer. When faced with sexual harassment, that sometimes is assumed that you are, because you are of African American, a hug is, and I love hugs, but it has a different context. And again, from Anita Hill, speaking back in the day, against and never denied by the individual that now holds a job for life as a Supreme Justice, it is very difficult in certain cultures and certain communities to believe that you're going to be believed. And I am one of those women who had sexual harassment that was disbelieved because you knew it was a joke. Well, why am I supposed to know it was a joke? And your wife wouldn't have laughed. So I think that we have to understand the context of it, and I hope that on your committees and your commissions that you have a diverse culture, an inclusive culture that looks in this. We're all in this together, but we're not all together as how it is perceived. And so there's no question.
Excellent point. Diversity does matter, too. Thank you. Over there's, yep, 3rd row.
This is just a point of clarification on the mention of the infamous Joseph McCarthy. He was not expelled from the Senate. He was censured and not allowed to speak for the remainder of his term, and subsequently passed away before the end of that term.
We appreciate parliamentarians at all times. Thank you for setting that record
I believe
straight.
Adam Clayton Powell was expelled, and then he was reelected.
So there's a lot of history here. Okay, right there, 3rd young man with a gray jacket on. Yep.
So I would like to actually take the comments here and phrase them as a question because I'm also interested. what should our state government do to take a more intersectional approach to sexual harassment so we are addressing the particular experiences of women of color, women with disabilities, women who are older, different places within the organization. There are, I think, a range of experiences, each with their own nuances that are maybe seen as small but are very significant. So I'm curious what you all think we should be doing.
Well, I think we would all say we should do more. Let me just tell you of an example, however, where the system seems to have worked. We do have ethics officers for each of the legislative caucuses. And one of my former colleagues, Elaine Neckritz, had a complaint from a staffer about egregious harassment, took that complaint to our ethics officer, and the victim was very comfortable with the result of that investigation and what happened at the end of that day. So I don't think anybody should leave here thinking that we don't do anything right. I agree with calls for more transparency, more accountability, but I don't want people to think that nothing good ever comes of a complaint that an employee makes, because there are examples where it really does work. Sometimes we go as far as beyond the ethics officer to the inspector general, but the ethics officers can take care of a fair number of the problems that staffers and others bring to them. So shout it from the rooftops. That's what we've got to do in Springfield, and we've got to do it across this land.
Great. Oh, did you want to say something, Gail?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So what this really makes me think about is that about 14% of the claims filed in the EEOC on sexual harassment nationally are from restaurant workers, which are disproportionately women of color. And, you know, I think this isn't just about how are you going to fix the ways that we govern, which is incredibly important because we are people who are making the laws. And this is a perfect example of, in every state that still has a tipped minimum wage, which I believe Illinois does, right?
We're better than the feds.
Yeah, okay.
But we're not at 15 yet.
Yeah, so the tip minimum wage in Rhode Island is $3.89 an hour, which means that's the only thing an employer is required to pay you, and then you make, as long as you make the minimum wage with your tips. And that's honestly what most people don't realize is the reality of being a restaurant worker and in the service industry in our country. And what that does is leave a huge, huge opportunity for sexual harassment, because women are constantly put in positions in which they do not have the capacity to challenge even their customer for doing something, because they will not make rent or eat or have the heat. And to me, as legislators, it's incredibly important for us to actually address those issues. Like, we can talk about how many ways something goes bad for us and root that out, and we absolutely should, and we should call attention to that and make people accountable for it. But if we don't change the laws that make that happen for everybody, and just not on how you report them, but how we've institutionalized sexual harassment and sex discrimination into our laws, we're not going to change the culture.
And I think one other point I'd like to make quickly is that on this particular issue and things that I've read and studied, is that we do have to begin, and I believe we've got a lot of work to do in a lot of areas, but we have to begin with ourselves and the legislatures, because when Tom Homer describes our process and how it's different than maybe some other processes, and we've got to get special authorization from an executive commission before we go forward, and all these other things that have been identified that we need to look at, I think we have to begin with ourselves, because if we continue to have stories of harassment and we sit in the seats that we sit, then how can we expect to reform other processes down the line? And we have to start with ourselves. I think we have to take a leadership role of zero tolerance on these issues, and I think that we have to continue to call it out. And if there are things to strengthen, the toughest process should be for legislators, in my opinion, because we are the people in power, and we need to make sure that our processes are strict. They need to be fair, of course, but we can't be having people think that we're doing things in secrecy and protecting ourselves.
Leading by example, excellent point.
Thanks. I have a question from our live stream. Elliot Hartstein asks, are there provisions to make sure that all employees in the General Assembly and lobbyists know how to make complaints with the LIG and know the way that process works, or is there some training that can be put in place for that?
We're working to make it clear. We have had, as a legislator in my office for the last 12 or 14 years, we have had little employee handbooks and so forth explaining what's acceptable and what isn't. And sex harassment has always been something unacceptable. And employees and I myself also sign little pieces of paper saying, we have read it, we know what we're doing. I don't think that it's working very well, and that's why we're doing a whole lot more training. That's why we're making sure that the lobbyists also undergo training. And I think that's very important as the first step to help people, because one of the things that training will do is show people what their options are, where they can go if they are looking for recourse. But the biggest issue for all of us, I think, is how to make the workplace harassment-free. Let's stop it at the front end, not just worry about what happens when the front end did not stop the way it should have.
And I would include campaign workers because many of us get to the position we're in now because of a robust campaign, and they should be in the same predicament held accountable to any type
I
of
think
harassment.
it's important, too, that there's a heightened awareness. So in the Senate task force, we have a kind of a flow chart that we've created. We'll be emailing it to all of our senators and asking them to post it in their offices, to post it. So if you are sexually harassed, you know where to go.
Let me take one more question. Way back there, there's two people, you guys, women first? Hang on, see. There are two women. Okay, well, you've got your hand up the highest. I didn't.
Hi, my name is Mamie Sanders, and what I wanted to ask was, I worked, well, in the federal sector because I was a mechanic for the railroad, and I worked around a lot of men, and I was sexually harassed, talked up under my clothes, machines named after my breasts. I took it to court. The attorney that I had, he didn't represent me properly, and there was abuse. Like what you said, I hate I did it. I hate I filed a complaint because since I did it, this has been back years ago, I have and still am being harassed. People sit in front of my door. They've made it very hard for me and my kids. I had to file a complaint against an attorney because he threatened me. The village that I stay in, I've had problems with them. All is stemmed from me filing the sexual harassment claim back years ago and what I had to endure. So I want to know, even back at that time, what could be done now, because they covered it up. It was covered up. And then what I did decide to do when they covered up, I decided to fight on my own. I started representing myself in the courts because, again, the attorney didn't represent me right. So I had no civil rights with the attorney in the courts, and then I didn't have any civil rights when I went in to represent myself. So I lost cause. So I would like to know what could be done for people like back in the day who have been sexually harassed and it never came out.
Well,
I wish I had an answer.
I don't know, maybe Tom, you want to try to respond to that?
Legal question.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's always a shame to hear a story like that. I assume this was a long time ago, correct? Yeah, I mean, the sad reality is that in your particular case, something that happened 20 years ago, you know, I'd like to give you the name of an attorney that'll take your case, but the reality is it's going to be very difficult to go back and redress wrongs that happened so many years ago. But thanks to you coming and speaking out, hopefully women today or other who have been offended will benefit from your story and will take action. And I'm just very sorry to hear your personal story.
One more thing is that when I decided to take the case up on my own and take the attorney in the court who didn't represent me properly. And I was able to obtain documents through discovery. He only used 8 documents in the court when he represented me. But when I did discovery, I found out he had 1,500 pieces of evidence, which I would have won if he had used and did his job.
And you are the reason why we have a Me Too movement. And I really want to applaud you for standing up and making that statement. Thank you very much. We have to go. But this has been an amazing conversation. I really want to thank every single panelist who is here today. They did an outstanding job. I want to thank everybody in the audience. You guys were great. And as we say sometimes, the best is yet to come. We're going to make this much better. Thank you very much.